Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR official 24 channel. Sienna never imagined her last breath would be spent in the dimly lit warehouse on the outskirts of town, where the echo of dripping water and the low hum of distant traffic blended into a haunting soundtrack. For the moment everything changed, but fate had a way of dragging people into scenes they were never meant to be in, weaving them into tragedies they never deserved, and as she stepped between Matt and Noah, without hesitation, without fear, guided purely by instinct and the fierce love she carried, she didn't think about death or sacrifice or consequences, only that Noah's life mattered more than her own, that she could not and would not stand by and watch him fall, not when she knew the darkness Matt carried inside him had grown too wild to control, too venomous to predict, and too determined to destroy anything that reminded him of the life he once wanted but could never have. The gunshot happened faster than a heartbeat, faster than the sound of Noah shouting her name, faster than the moment she realized she had moved, and the bullet tore through the air with ruthless precision, Matt's intention sharp, cold, unyielding, but the world slowed in the space between trigger and impact, stretching time into something surreal and excruciating, and Sienna felt a strange calm settle over her, as though she had always known this was the direction her path would lead, as though every moment she had ever lived was simply aligning her for this final act. And when the searing pain exploded in her chest she staggered only slightly, her breath catching, her eyes widening not in shock but in something like relief, because Noah was still standing, alive, untouched, and the small, trembling exhale he released told her everything. He understood what she had done, he understood the cost she had paid, and the horror on his face was enough to break her heart even as hers fluttered and faltered inside her ribcage. Noah lunged forward, catching her before her knees hit the ground, his arms wrapping around her, his voice cracking with panic as he begged her to breathe, begged her to look at him, begged her to hold on because he wasn't ready, he would never be ready, to lose her, not like this, not because of him, and Sienna wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that she chose this, that she would choose it again and again if it meant he lived, but her lungs were struggling to pull in air and her throat felt tight and thick, and though she tried to speak, the words came out as broken whispers, barely audible over the ringing in her ears. Matt, still holding the gun, stared in disbelief, his expression collapsing into something lost and frantic as though he hadn't meant for her to intervene, hadn't meant for her to be the one to bleed, but his intention no longer mattered. He had crossed too many lines to ever claim innocence, and Noah's glare burned with a fury that could have ignited the walls around them, but he refused to let rage pull him away from Sienna. Refused to loosen his grip on her even as Matt stumbled backward, muttering something that sounded like regret twisted with self-justification, ultimately fleeing into the shadows while Noah screamed after him, his voice trembling with a promise of vengeance he had never spoken before. But Noah's attention snapped back to Sienna immediately, his trembling hands pressing against the wound as if sheer will could stop the flow of blood staining her shirt, and Sienna felt warmth spreading beneath his fingers, too warm, too fast, and she knew, with a quiet certainty, that this was the end, yet she found peace in Noah's arms, in his touch, in the familiar scent of him as he cradled her close, whispering he needed her, that she couldn't leave him, that she was stronger than this. Begging her to stay awake, stay present, stay alive. Memories flickered behind her eyes like pieces of a life flashing before its final curtain, Noah smiling the first day they met, the softness of his voice when he said her name, the brush of his fingertips along her cheek the first time he kissed her, the arguments, the promises, the steady heartbeat she listened to when she lay with her head on his chest, every beautiful moment she never thought would mean goodbye. She blinked slowly, trying to focus on Noah's face, trying to memorize every line, every shadow, every glimmer of hope and heartbreak swirling in his eyes, and she tried to lift her hand to touch him, to reassure him, but her arm felt heavy, unresponsive, as though her body was already slipping away before she had the chance to properly let go. The world around her blurred, colors fading into muted smudges as her vision dimmed, but Noah's voice remained sharp enough to cling to, his pleas cutting through the haze, telling her he loved her, telling her he was sorry, telling her he should have protected her, but Sienna knew he had given her far more than protection, he had given her purpose, given her something worth fighting for, something worth dying for, and as she tried to form a smile, a faint curve of her lips that barely held shape She finally managed to breathe out the words she had always meant to say, "It's okay." Those were her last fully formed words, soft, fragile, almost lost to the air, but Noah heard them and shook his head violently, refusing to accept them, refusing to accept any reality where she wasn't beside him, and his tears fell onto her skin, warm against the chilling pallor creeping across her face. The warehouse lights flickered overhead, casting long shifting shadows across the floor, and time felt suspended in the space between life and loss, but Sienna could feel her heartbeat slowing, each thump weaker than the last, fading like a whisper carried off by the wind. She remembered thinking, strangely, almost peacefully, that death didn't feel how she'd expected. It wasn't cold or chaotic or suffocating, but rather like drifting into sleep after a long, exhausting journey, and though she wanted desperately to stay awake for Noah, to give him one more moment, one more breath, one more memory, her eyelids grew heavy, fluttering shut even as she fought to keep them open. Noah shook her gently, calling her name over and over, his voice cracking into raw anguish, and though she tried to respond, her body no longer obeyed her, her consciousness slipping like sand through fingertips, and the warehouse around her faded until only the sensation of Noah holding her remained. His arms tightened around her as though he could anchor her to the world, but her final exhale escaped in a soft, trembling sigh, and then, quietly, irrevocably, Sienna was still. Noah froze, disbelief washing over him in crushing waves as he whispered her name again, searching for any sign of breath, any faint movement, any miracle, but the truth settled with brutal finality: she was gone. The love of his life, the woman who had stepped into the line of fire without hesitation, had died in his arms to save him, leaving Noah shattered in a silence so heavy it seemed to press the air out of the room. He lowered his forehead to hers, closing his eyes, letting grief consume him in full, unrestrained force, and the pain inside him felt like something tearing open, raw and endless, a wound no amount of time would heal. He didn't know how long he stayed there holding her, minutes, hours, years in the span of a heartbeat, but when he finally lifted his head, he felt something shift inside him, something dark and determined, because Matt had taken the woman he loved, ripped her from him with violence and jealousy and madness, and no one knew that justice, real justice, would not come from the law, not for something this personal. He carefully laid Sienna down, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his fingers trembling as he whispered a promise that he would not let her death be in vain, that he would make Matt answer for what he had done, and that Sienna would always, always be the light he carried with him even in the darkest parts of the path he now walked. As Noah stood, the grief in his eyes hardened into resolve, and though his heart felt hollow, broken beyond repair, one truth echoed fiercely through the wreckage of his soul: Sienna had died saving him, and now he would live for her, or destroy himself trying to set right the nightmare Matt had unleashed. And in the quiet aftermath of her final sacrifice, as the warehouse settled into eerie stillness, it was clear that Sienna's death was not the end of the story, but the tragic beginning of a new chapter, one that would change everything, because love had driven her to take the bullet meant for Noah, and love, in all its devastating power, would now drive Noah toward a reckoning he could no longer avoid. Noah didn't remember walking out of the warehouse, couldn't recall how his legs carried him through the doorway when every part of him felt crushed beneath the weight of grief, but somehow he emerged into the cold night air, the breeze brushing against his tear-soaked face like a cruel reminder that the world kept moving even when his head stopped, and he stood there for a long, trembling moment, staring up at the dark sky as though expecting the stars to flicker out in acknowledgement of the life that had been extinguished inside. His hands were still stained with Sienna's blood, the deep red turning almost black under the streetlights, and he curled his fingers into fists, feeling the tacky residue crack as his knuckles whitened, a physical representation of the rage, sorrow, and numbness battling inside him. The air tasted metallic, bitter, like the last echoes of the gunshot still lingered, haunting him, tormenting him, and Noah found himself gripping the edge of the nearest wall, bending forward as a wave of sobs tore through him, violent and uncontrollable, each one ripping open the wound inside his chest that would never fully heal. He pressed his forehead against the cold concrete, letting the tremors in his body shake through him until he felt empty, drained, like a shell of the person he had been only hours ago. When he finally lifted his head, his face streaked with tears and the faint residue of dust, something inside him had shifted, not in a way he fully understood, but in the way a storm settles after tearing apart everything it touches, leaving only ruins behind. His heart felt raw and hollow, but a single, burning thread of purpose wove through him. Matt had taken the most precious person in his life, had stolen her future, her laughter, her warmth, and Noah refused to let that atrocity stand unanswered. His grief was no longer just grief, it had hardened into a resolve so sharp it cut through the numbness, a vow formed in the ashes of devastation, and he whispered Sienna's name into the night, a soft promise carried by the wind, "I'll make this right. I swear." The walk back to town felt unreal, each step mechanical, disconnected from the thoughts storming through his head, and the lights of the city blurred as though seen through water, leaving streaks of color that reminded him painfully of the blood on his hands. People passed him on the sidewalk, unaware of the war raging inside him, unaware that his heart had just been ripped out, unaware that the man walking beside them was no longer whole. He wondered if they would care, if they knew, if they would stop, offer comfort, say they were sorry, but Noah didn't want sorry, didn't want sympathy or gentle words or hollow assurances. What he wanted was justice. Not the kind written in laws or courtrooms, but the kind that reached into the core of a man and demanded retribution for the love he'd been forced to bury. When he reached his apartment, he closed the door behind him and stood in the darkness for several long seconds, the silence wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud, reminding him of the echoing emptiness that now filled every part of his life. He looked around the room, at the reminders of Sienna scattered everywhere, her jacket draped over the back of the couch, her mug still sitting on the counter from the tea she had made hours before, her laugh frozen in a photograph on the wall. Noah's throat tightened painfully as he approached the picture, running a trembling thumb across her smiling face, and he swallowed hard, fighting the wave of agony rising in his chest. He whispered her name again, barely audible, and the room seemed to absorb the sound, storing it like a sacred echo. For a moment, he allowed himself to collapse on the couch, burying his face in his hands, letting the grief roll over him with crushing force, but then, slowly, steadily, his breathing changed. His sobs quieted. And in their place rose something cold, deliberate, and terrifyingly clear. Matt knew what he had done. He had aimed at Noah. He had fired with intent to kill. And Sienna had stepped into the line of fire because she loved him enough to die for him. Noah's hands lowered from his face, his eyes narrowing, a flame igniting behind them despite the devastation hollowing him out. Matt hadn't just taken someone from him, he had created a new version of Noah, one carved from grief and fire, one who could not, would not, rest until justice was served. Noah stood abruptly, feeling a sudden surge of clarity as he moved toward the drawer where he kept the photographs, notes, and documents tied to Matt's increasingly erratic behavior over the past months. He dumped the contents onto the coffee table, sifting through them with shaking fingers, paper after paper detailing Matt's spiraling jealousy, the threats he had made, the warnings Sienna had quietly expressed about him, and the moments Noah had brushed off because he didn't want to believe Matt was capable of genuine darkness. But he had been wrong. Fatally wrong. Sienna had paid the price for that mistake. Noah closed his eyes tightly, forcing himself not to fall apart again, and when he opened them, the determination in his expression had solidified, becoming something fierce and unwavering. Matt wasn't going to disappear into the shadows. Matt wasn't going to escape. Noah would find him, and when he did, there would be no forgiveness. He gathered the documents into a folder, grabbed his jacket, and headed back out into the night, driven by a force he couldn't have stopped even if he'd wanted to. The streets were quieter now, the hour late enough that the city had settled into its early morning calm, but Noah felt anything but calm as he made his way toward the police station. He needed them to know what happened. Needed Matt's name on every bulletin, every alert, every officer's mind. But as he pushed open the glass doors and stepped inside, the harsh fluorescent lights made him blink, and suddenly the reality of speaking about Sienna's death out loud hit him like a physical blow. He approached the front desk, the officer behind it looking up from her paperwork with neutral professionalism, but the moment she saw Noah's blood-stained shirt and haunted expression, her demeanor shifted to concerned urgency. "Sir, are you hurt?" she asked, rising from her chair. Noah shook his head numbly. Not me, he said, his voice strained, rough from crying. Sienna, she's gone. The words tasted like poison on his tongue, each syllable burning. The officer guided him to a nearby bench, asking questions he barely heard, and soon other officers gathered, taking notes as Noah recounted everything: the warehouse, the confrontation, the gunshot, Matt's escape. Saying it aloud made it feel even more real, more final, and Noah's voice cracked several times, but he forced himself to continue, gripping the edge of the bench so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he finished, the room was heavy with silence. The officers exchanged looks, murmured into radios, began initiating protocols, but all Noah could feel was the hollow echo of loss reverberating through him. An officer approached him gently, placing a hand on his shoulder, but Noah barely felt it, his mind drifting back to Sienna's final breath, the faint whisper of, "It's okay," the way her body had gone limp in his arms. Eventually, after hours of questions and statements and formalities he hardly remembered, Noah stepped back into the early morning air, the sky beginning to lighten with soft hues of pale pink and muted blue. Dawn was breaking, a new day beginning, but Noah felt trapped in the moment Sienna died, unable to move past it, unable to imagine a world where he would wake up without her beside him. He walked aimlessly, unsure where he was going, until he found himself at the riverside, the same place he and Sienna had walked countless times, talking about dreams they hadn't known would be stolen from them. The river glimmered under the rising sun, peaceful and quiet, but Noah felt none of that peace. Instead, he felt a sharp pang in his chest as memories flooded him, her laughter echoing across the water, the way she'd nudge him playfully, the way she'd look at him like he was her whole world. He sank onto the bench they always shared, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, staring blankly at the flowing water. He didn't know how long he sat there, time felt meaningless, but eventually the numbness was replaced by a slow, burning determination. Grief had broken him. But love, Sienna's love, would rebuild him, harder, sharper, fiercer. She had died protecting him. And now he would honor her not by drowning in sorrow, but by ensuring the man who pulled the trigger never harmed anyone again. Noah rose from the bench, taking one last look at the river as the sun continued to rise, casting warm golden light across the world that felt colder without Sienna. He placed a hand over his heart, whispering softly, "I'll do this for you." Then he turned away, stepping into the day with a new purpose, one forged from tragedy, fueled by love, and unbreakable in its resolve. The hunt for Matt had begun, and Noah would follow it to the bitter end.